Welcome to the History Den YouTube channel. This is the 6th video in the Ancient Greek series. So, in previous videos we have discussed the role of the polis in Greek society. We now come to one of the greatest poli of all. Oh, by the way, poli is the plural of polis. So, poli means multiple cities. Now, if you went back to ancient Greek times and you asked the average Greek, who is the greatest poli of all time? They would probably look at you funny and say, well, that's a silly question. It's Sparta, of course. Now, today we might say Athens because of all the philosophers and Athens' impact on democracy. But in those days, Sparta was admired by all the Greeks as the embodiment of the polis. Now, the Spartans became the leading polis of a loose collection of city-states in a place called Laconia, and that is in the southern Peloponnesus, and I'll show you a map here in a few minutes. Now, as I said before, Sparta was admired by other Greeks during their time because Sparta had the virtues associated with the ideal polis. Now, although Greeks admired it, it didn't mean they were willing to live under it, mainly because of the rigid way the Spartans lived. So let's take a look at every aspect of Spartan society and how this titanic polis ultimately became what it turned out to be. But before we do that, let's briefly review what's going on in the Peloponnesus before the Spartans are around. Before the Greek Dark Ages, we have the MESSENIANs, who speak a form of Achaean. Now, when the Dark Ages come around after the fall of Mycenaean Greece, a group of people called the Dorians arrive in the Peloponnesus, and they speak a different form of Greek from Achaean. To complicate matters, the Achaeans too are still hanging around, so there is a cultural and linguistic divide between these two tribes. Eventually, the Dorians become the dominant player in the Peloponnesus. So when we first see Sparta, it is Dorians that are running the show. The Achaeans by this time have lost out and are under Dorian control, if you want to think of it like that. Early on, there is nothing really unique about Sparta that we can distinguish, as it came to be known during classical Greek times. The Spartans have a vibrant culture that shows some of the finest examples of pottery and art. There is even poetry, if you can imagine that, in Sparta of all places. So they are participating in the same cultural activities as other Greek city-states. And then it's as if all of that just disappears, overnight, literally. And they move completely away from the arts towards a city-state that is completely focused and centered 100% on everything military. Now, the ancient Greeks attributed this to a man named Lycurgus, who you can see up there in the top right. He is the semi-legendary ancient lawgiver and kind of a founding father of Sparta. This probably occurred sometime in the 9th century BC. Now, as I said, this is the traditional explanation from the ancient Greeks, although some modern scholars tend to doubt the Lycurgus story ever existed. But I tend to think there was someone named Lycurgus, and he undoubtedly created some laws, but certainly later developments after the MESSENIAN Wars are what formed Sparta as we came to know it during classical Greece. So that seems more closer to the truth than the story of one man creating Spartan society. But still, we can't discount that he existed in some way, and that he had at least some influence over Sparta early on. Now, before we get to the MESSENIAN Wars, let's take a look at the topography of the Peloponnesus. If you look here, you'll see Sparta, and you'll notice that it's surrounded by two massive mountain ranges. Mount Parnon to the east, and Mount Taygetus to the west. Mount Taygetus is the important mountain here because it acts as a natural barrier between the Messenians and the Spartans. And if you look at that picture in the bottom right there, you can see just how rugged that mountain is. It was pretty much, for all intents and purposes, impassable. So if the Spartans wanted to go to Messenia and attack Messenia, they had to go all the way north and then hang a left where the mountains finally receded. So it was a huge undertaking for these Messenian wars. The Spartans had to do a lot of logistical planning just to get there. Now we'll just take a look at some of the other cities. Down here by the sea is Gythia. That was the main port for the Spartans. And up here is Argos. Now they were a major competitor of Sparta, and pretty much they always disagreed on something. And Argos itself was a major city and very powerful city that was constantly, as I said, opposed to the Spartans. So take a look at these massive mountain ranges. You can get an idea how tough the Spartans must have been. This was not an easy area in Greece to live. It was a very difficult area, and in the winters it got extremely cold. So this is what made the Spartans as tough as they turned out to be. Okay, so let's move on now, and after Lycurgus, we moved to a time period in the late 8th century between about 725 and 700 BC. And during this time, the Spartans enter a war against their neighbors, the Messenians. This has since been called the First Messenian War. Now, the territory of Messenia, as I just showed you, lies directly to the west of Sparta. The Messenians had their own distinct identity, and they were on their way to establishing their own powerful city-state. But the Spartans conquered them during this war and forced them to become what we call helots. That is, they are forced into a form of serfdom to provide food to the Spartans. But this war was no easy war, and it was fought over 2 decades, which is really a long time according to Greek standards. If you remember in the last video I did on the phalanx, we talked about hoplite engagements maybe lasting only a few hours. But this one goes on for years. And the Messenians did not give up easily. Even after the Messenians were for all intents and purposes defeated, they still refused to give in and fell back to the heavily fortified Mount Ithome. If you take a look at this picture on the right, that is the view from the summit of Mount Ithome. So you get an idea of what the Spartans faced when they were trying to dislodge the Messenians from their strong point. Only after several Spartan assaults were the Messenians finally compelled to surrender. But even though the Spartans ultimately prevailed, the Messenians are permanently angry at Sparta and never really think of themselves as part of Spartan society. So this is something the Spartans always have to think about going forward before committing to any foreign wars. Because if they do leave the region, they are leaving behind this rebellious bunch of Messenians. Still, the acquisition of Messenia was a huge boost to the Spartans. They now had a permanent source of food and a much larger land area. So as I just said, the Messenians were not content to be the doormat of the Spartans, and predictably another Messenian War broke out. This occurred somewhere between 650 and 625. Once again, this was not a typical Greek battle. It was another long, hard fight for the Spartans. It was much harder because Argos and Arcadia, to the north of Sparta, supported the Helots in their fight. So this isn't just the Helots against the Spartans. It's the Helots and their allies fighting against the Spartans. But mainly they are all trying to stop the Spartan expansion from happening. After this war is completed and the Spartans win, the Helots are again forced back into this form of serfdom and must work the farms to provide food for their Spartan masters. And so this opens up an interesting quandary. There is slavery in Greece at this time, but there was no area in Greece where an entire region is enslaved. So the Spartans are one of the biggest slave-owning states in Greece. And yet later on, of course, during the Persian Wars, it is the Spartans who are defending all of Greece against the subjugation of a king. And yet the Spartans have no problems enslaving the fellow Greeks in their own neighborhood. So after the Messenian Wars are completed, many scholars believe the Spartans produced their constitution as it became known during classical Greece. And again, this is contrary to the Lycurgian legend. But certainly after the Messenian Wars, the Spartans have their laws in place to produce the finest military the world has ever seen. In order to understand a Spartan, we should first look at their life from childhood all the way through adulthood. That is, from birth to adulthood, every aspect of a Spartan male's training was controlled by the state. I think if one word would describe the Spartans, it would be the word judge. That is, at all times, Spartans were being judged as to whether they can cut it. Can you participate in this rigid system? Can they be a Spartiate? Think of it almost as the worst weeding out system you can possibly think of. It would almost be like being admitted into Harvard and then having to reapply, not every year, not every month, but every day just to get back in. It's just that hard. The whole goal of this was to produce the finest warriors in the ancient world. And mainly, this was done because Spartans do not do things in the normal way that you might expect of other Greek city-states. So at birth, the child was first examined for his physical health, his physical condition. If in any way he fails his test, the baby is simply put to death. And the key point here is this is not a decision that's made by the family. It's a decision made by the state, probably one of the elders. If the child survives that vital first test, They get to live at home for the next 6 years. And you might say this is the only normal part of the Spartan male's life. After that, it starts to get seriously intense. At age 7, the boy is placed in a military school which is called the agoge. This was really more of a constant boot camp. So the boy will stay there for the rest of his youth. The school is run by the older boys, so this must have been really tough on the younger boys that first entered these schools. And to make matters worse, the older boys were allowed to rough up the younger boys. So the idea here is that you're going to be a very tough person if you survive what I would call the boot camp from hell. At this school, the boy is provided with just one cloak. That is it. Nothing else. No pants, no shoes, no cap, nothing else. Now, in Sparta, the winter is a very, very cold place to be. Remember those mountains I showed you? It's situated between those mountains. This is not located against the warm Mediterranean coast. They also provide little food, so you are forced to hunt for food if you want to live. Now, if you did not make it past the agoge, you were no longer a Spartan, and therefore you had none of the privileges accorded to a Spartiate. So if a Spartan man survived, and by this point they are young men, if they survived the agoge at age 20, they joined the army. The service could last up to age 60. Now, the Spartans liked to do everything in the same way. Once they entered the military, they were essentially looked at as ancient robots. Every single day, the warriors ate the same exact meals, with the same exact men, in the same exact common mess. All of these men fought together on the battlefield. This created a unique and personal bond between each of the soldiers. Now something else happens after they graduate. For the first time they will experience marriage. But they are not allowed to live with their wives, which is really strange. They had to sneak away to be with their wives, but they were expected to live and eat with the other soldiers in the mess at all times. So why was all of this done? Well, on one hand, Sparta needed to produce children, but they wanted the soldier to remain close to his fellow soldiers rather than the bond of a family. So the entire point of this is to develop the closest possible bond you could between soldiers by having them live together constantly rather than their wives. So the idea here is when you went into battle, you were fighting with guys that had become your close pals. I also want to mention that Spartan warriors did not take it easy during times of peace. Instead, they were in a perpetual state of training. The training was so intense that it was often said the Spartans were one of the few armies that found it easier to go into battle. In fact, it's probable that the Spartans feared their training more than any army they faced in the field. Okay, so let's move along here. All Greeks loved war and everything military. Fighting was in their blood as a whole. But Sparta took this to an even higher level. Their rigid following of the principles of the polis allowed Sparta to create a military reputation that has survived throughout the ages. The Spartan warrior, as mentioned before, was put through one of the most intensive training regiments ever known. So now let's take a look at some of the attributes of an average Spartan soldier. The key aspect to everything was discipline. If an ancient army wanted to achieve success on the battlefield, soldiers had to be willing to fight and, if necessary, die. An individual soldier's discipline could be decisive in the course of a battle. The Spartans had no fear of death since there could be no higher honor achieved than to die on the battlefield. Self-sacrifice for the state was a sworn duty of every Spartan warrior. As a result, the Spartan army was considered almost invincible. Add to that, a Spartan could only attain a funeral by dying in combat. This fierce reputation caused many other city-states in Greece to avoid battle with the Spartans at all costs. Thus, the Spartan army was rarely forced into an actual battle. Despite their ferocious reputation, the Spartans engaged in military conflict only as a last resort. This allowed Sparta to avoid long and costly wars of attrition, something that their small population simply could not afford. Now back to the Spartan attributes for a minute. As a Spartan, you were expected to pay absolute attention and obedience to your superiors. Another quality was courage and uniformity. Everyone is the same, as we just mentioned. They all go through the same things together and eat together, all of those things. Loyalty to the state and polis was considered the highest ethos. There is one contradiction, though. Each warrior was expected to compete in order to be honored and glorified for their deeds on the battlefield. Yet they had to fight as a single cohesive unit, so there is a little bit of a tension there between those two attributes. I should mention that age was very important to the Spartans. The older you are, the more respect you earned, and you were generally treated better than a younger person. However, if you performed well on the battlefield, you were given the honor and respect accorded to you regardless of your age. All men would have to give way to you because you had earned your respect as a good and competent soldier. That being said, the worst thing for a Spartan was to falter in battle. If you underperformed, you were shamed and might even lose your citizenship. People would avoid you like you were the bubonic plague. And even your sisters would not be allowed to marry, because who wants to be married to the sister of a coward? It was just that draconian in Sparta. Now, given the attributes we just described, let's talk about the Spartan phalanx for a moment. The Spartans would perfect the ancient phalanx like no other. The Spartans contained no weak left, center, or right flank, because in theory, each Spartan warrior was of the same fighting ability. This meant that the enemy would have little success attempting to overrun the Spartan left flank, since it was just as strong as the right flank. This also meant that the Spartans could deliver a knockout punch against either flank of the enemy, resulting in almost certain victory. The Spartans always attempted, like many other Greek city-states, to end the battle as quickly as possible. They accomplished this by using extreme shock tactics in the first few minutes of battle. Terror was just as an effective weapon as any spear or sword. Okay, so let's keep rolling along here. Let's talk now about the Spartan government. And we talked earlier a little bit about the Spartan constitution and how everything kind of unspooled from there, and how it was formed after the MESSENIAN Wars. Now, the Spartan constitution was very unique in terms of the Greek polis. It cannot really be called anything with the strongest confidence, because it's kind of a mix between a democracy, an oligarchy, and even a monarchy, but it certainly leads more towards an oligarchy. The Spartans had 2 royal lines with 2 different kings. Now, this is really strange, because most countries have a memory of 1 king, not 2. And adding to the complexity was the fact that each king could veto the other guy. So these are not really kings with powers in the true sense we like to think of a monarch. The kings were also the military generals. They could also act as judges, and they performed duties that were expected of other kings. They handed out important honors and awards, stuff like that. One important note is the king didn't have to go through the intensive training that the average Spartan soldier had to. That is, they didn't have to attend the agoge that we talked about earlier. And the probable reason is they probably didn't want their kings to die in that intensive training. Now, during times of peace, the kings had little power, but during times of war, their power was almost unchecked. So this allowed little internal dissent, which might derail the war effort, which was always the most important consideration to ancient Sparta. Okay, so let's take a look at the various bodies in the Spartan government. The first is the Gerousia. The Gerousia was a council of elders that acted as an advisory committee. It was made up of 28 men over the age of 60. Now, this functioned more like a senate and probably was the closest thing to a democracy, since they were elected. The 2 kings also sat on this council, so it brought the number up to 30. An appointment to the Gerousia was for life, so these guys had a lot of power. Like the Roman Senate, the Gerousia was the most important body in the Spartan government. Let's now talk about the next body of government, called the Ephors. This was a council made up of just 5 men, but it played a very critical part in Spartan society. It had the power to impeach kings. The body was made up of 5 ordinary men with no political connections. The word ephor means overseer, and as I said before, their main duty was to keep watch over the kings and to make sure they did not abuse their power. It is important to note that the ephor's term was only 1 year, so they could not run again, so their power was limited in that sense. If the ephors brought charges against the king, the trial would be held in the Gerousia. So this is interesting in that the king could be charged by the ordinary men in Sparta. Now let's talk about the Spartan Assembly. The Spartan Assembly constituted all adult Spartan male citizens that were of fighting age. The assembly made decisions to go to war or make peace. I think that was pretty much their main function. All Spartans came to this meeting in full military dress, and roll calls were taken by banging on your shield. Although every Spartan citizen is present, only the king or members of the Gerousia spoke, although everybody was able to vote at the end of the session. Now, you might ask the question, how on earth could anything ever get done with all these government bodies in place? And I think the answer here is that you couldn't get anything done, and that's the entire point. The Spartans don't want to change. They want to resist any new ideas that might upset the balance and traditions they have. So the best way to do that is to have this massive system of checks and balances in place to block any new legislation. So Sparta is a highly conservative society resistant to change. So its constitution is solely concerned with making the best warriors and keeping their city the most powerful in Greece. Maybe it's similar to the way the United States operates today. The U.S. has to have the strongest military in the world to put the fear in any would-be attackers. So as you can see, there's a lot of connections between then and now. Not a lot has really changed in the way nations train and produce their warriors. The only difference is the Spartans did it like no other. Alright, so let's keep moving along here. Let's now take a look at the class system that existed in Spartan society. So we've already mentioned some of these classes before, so you probably have a good working understanding. But let's get into a little bit more detail. The upper class were the Spartiates. Yep, you guessed it, these were the citizens, and the only citizens. We can assume they probably were Dorians, but it's possible there might have been some other Greek speakers in there as well. Now, as a citizen, you only have one single job. That is to train and then go to war. That's it. They served no other function in the Spartan economy, which is so very different from every other Greek city. Nobody had a situation like that, where the citizen did nothing but depended on the slavery of others to provide their daily needs. When I say slavery, of course, I mean the Helots. Now, there was a middle class in place. They are called the Periokoi. I believe I pronounced that correct in the Greek vernacular. Now, the Periokoi do not live in the city as Spartiates. Again, these are not citizens, but they are not slaves either. So as I said, they kind of function as a middle class. Since the Periokoi couldn't live in Sparta itself, they live around Laconia. And they are free to engage in trade and industry and basically to provide all the goods to the Spartan soldier. What do I mean by these goods? Well, the swords, the shields, everything the Spartans would need to go to war. And we come to the Helots, who we talked about in the MESSENIAN Wars. The Helots, not surprisingly, occupied the lowest spot in Spartan society. Each Helot was assigned a piece of land which they were expected to farm. In addition, each Helot is assigned a particular Spartan master. The Helot is expected to provide some of his produce, I think about 50%, to that Spartan warlord. So again, they are not providing food specifically to Sparta. They are providing their output to an assigned master. The class structure, like the government, was specifically designed with the one aim of developing a finely tuned war machine, and that it certainly accomplished. The Periokoi and Helots allowed the Spartiates to concentrate solely on the arts of war. Because all of their goods were produced by the Helots and Periokoi, the Spartans themselves saw no need for currency. Gold and silver and money were completely banned, as Spartans believed it might corrupt their citizens. Well, maybe the Spartans had something there, because look at all the greed we have today in the financial institutions. Okay, let's move along here, and this is the final slide. Sorry about this. This video is dragging on a lot longer than I thought it would. But I need to talk about one final thing, and that is the nature of the Peloponnesian League. Now, in that previous slide, we talked about the class system. I should point out that the Helots and the Periokoi outnumbered the Spartans considerably. I think at one point there might have been 70 to 100,000 Messenians, and at Sparta's height there were only 10,000. So Sparta could not afford to be at war with everybody, and they realized that very early on and decided to form an alliance. And that alliance has since been called the Peloponnesian League. Now, it started after the Spartans' war with the Tegeans. The defeat of Tegea was very important because it lies just north of Sparta, and it controlled the road to Sparta. So it was very strategically important to the Spartans. After this, the Spartans decided to offer Tegea a defensive alliance. So the Spartans did not really abuse the Tegeans. In fact, they pretty much left them alone. The only thing they demanded was that the Tegeans turn over their foreign policy to the Spartans. In return, the Spartans did not take their lands or cities or burn down their fields, and they even offered protection to the Tegeans. Many other states in the central and provincial northern Peloponnese joined the league, which eventually included all Peloponnesian states. What's important about this alliance is that it's the first time anything like this had been seen in Greece. It ended most of the wars in the Peloponnesus. This also meant the Spartans didn't have to worry as much about rebellions and gain more troops for their army. More troops, as they required member states to provide forces for any foreign wars that started. So again, this is an alliance concerned primarily with foreign affairs, but also making sure that Sparta has a powerful buffer between any states that might think of attacking her. The powerful members included Corinth and Arcadian cities. I should point out that not all cities joined the league. Argos, the most notable city, often refused to join. The league made the Spartans and their allies the strongest military force in Greece. Despite these huge advantages, the Spartans often did not fight in foreign wars. The main reason, as I mentioned before, was the Helot problem. The Spartans did not like to fight far away from home because they knew the Helots hated them and they could rebel at any time. The other problem is Argos, who is located in the Peloponnesus as well. And Argos is always a big problem for the Spartans, and it seemed like the Argives were at war with the Spartans at least once a century. So the Spartans had an inherent danger in the Peloponnesus which they could not ignore. Okay, that is going to wrap it up for the Spartans. I hope you found this really helpful. And if you liked it, feel free to check out my other videos on my History Den YouTube channel. And in the next video, we're going to be talking about the great rivals of the Spartans in ancient Greece, the Athenians. See you guys then.